of the scroller. I'm going to crack through a video fairly fast because there's a lot to cover. So I'll start with being in a regular breakdance page with two sections. So far all I've done is set up those two sections so that they are 50 viewport height. Other than that, nothing special. So we're going to go and we're going to add our scroller, so scroll slider like any other section, and it sits in the middle. You come with the default heading and text element. Again, I'm not going to mess about with them. You can put images inside, you can put more text inside, you can put columns and grids inside, anything you like. The more complicated, the harder it is to manage, same with anything else, I guess. For the time being, what we're going to do is leave the heading and the text, and I'm just going to add some background images so that we can see the slider moving along a bit more obviously. Now you can move the slides here so you can switch between them. I have tried enabling this in Breakdance, but actually while I can, it just makes editing a real pain because you have to keep scrolling past it. So it's easier to do it this way. So background image for the second slide. There we go. It's the second violin. Let's use a saxophone instead. So there we are. We have two slides, saxophone and a violin. And if I view this on the front end, we have the violin and the saxophone. That's it. We're scrolling sideways. We haven't done anything else. That's it. So out the box, as it were, we're already off. So switching back, I'm going to duplicate the slide. Do that the same way as you would duplicate any other element. And then on the third scroll slide, if I zoom across so I can see what I'm doing, I can choose that slide. And I will change the background. And let's have a banjo. So now we have three slides, but you can put as many as you like, and you can change all sorts of things. Like you can change the width of individual slides. So if we want the first slide to be a different size, first of all, boom, our container width, and say, all right, we want that to be 600 pixels, and now that slide will be 600 pixels, and it'll just work as any other slide. So I'm going to stick with the larger ones just for the simplicity of the demo. So going back to the scroll slider main options, our sticking options are the main behaviors really. So we start with the stick position, which is 0, and 0 is basically here at the top of the viewport. So if I wanted to stick this element, maybe the bottom of this element, to the bottom of the screen, I would set my sticky position to be 100% down from the top, and I would set my anchor to be the bottom of the element here. But that is because this is a 100% viewport height. It's exactly the same with sticking the top to 0. But if you had an element that was, say, only half the viewport height, you could then stick it at 75 from the top, and it would be exactly in the middle of the screen. So that's your sticky position and your anchor. They decide where this slider should be when it begins to stick and move horizontally. Now the scrolling type. First of all, we've got scrolling, which is your basic scroller, which is the one we've got here. It simply moves left and right. Then we have a few other options. So snapping, that will move left and right and snap to each section. Again, you can have any section width and it will just snap to the beginning and end of them. The effects will allow you to add effects to it. So again, we will look at more of these in detail, but some of the effects that you can have are to scale up and down, or let's have a look, the scale type, the effect here, scale, X and Y, so you've got the global scale, and then you've got width and height scale. You can skew it, you can have it move up and down the screen. In fact, we choose that one just so you can see what that means. When we choose an effect, we then have to say the start of the effect. So I'm going to say 100%, and the end of the effect is 0%. And I'll explain these in more detail in a second, but I'm going to set our speeds to normal. And then again, if we save that and then whip to the front and refresh our screen, you can see that it starts at 100% and it gradually moves up the screen. Now, the effects are all a bit obvious. I mean, I think this is quite nice, but again, they might not all work. So I've given the freedom to choose whatever effect you like and how much of it is applied and whatnot. And it's just kind of play about them, see ones that work for you or that you feel like are nice and subtle. The effects will be switched off on mobile. I've tried everything in the universe to get things to work on mobile, but it's incredibly difficult. There's so many different devices, and speaking to the GSAP people who made all the animation libraries and everything, they have also said just don't, because it can't be done. So the effects are for desktop. It will still scroll on mobile, but not with the effects. So as I say, you've got rotations and skews and scales and stuff that you can use as effects. I suggest a little bit here and there might be a nice effect, but again, it will switch off on mobile. So the effects once, it will only show the effects the first time you view. And we go back to our screen, we've already seen this once now, so when we go backwards there's no effect, and if we head up the screen and go backwards there's no effect. Okay. And the next thing to show you may notice as you get to the end of here, there's occasionally, and I've got this scrolling a little bit slowly, so it's not too bad, but occasionally you get a bit of a jump at the end there. You can see that. So we also now have a buffer. If we go back to our scroll type, and sorry, I keep calling up that menu, my zoom button is the control key, so that's so back to scrolling. If we add a little buffer in, what that will do is when you're looking at the scroller, as you scroll down, it will, you can see the scroll bar hopefully, if you watch the scroll bar here, moving up and down a little bit. It just gives you a momentary buffer so that when the person meets your horizontal section, it doesn't immediately flick to the right. It gives you just enough time to make it feel smooth, and they can go, oh, hang on, I'm supposed to read this. And then at the opposite end, you get the buffer on the opposite end. So if they come to the end of your page, it doesn't just fly off. It just gives you a moment of scrolling before you go back. Not perfect yet. I'm working on that. But again, I've spoken to the GSAP folk, and that's about as good as you're going to get. So it's about building the horizontal slider, knowing these things rather than trying to fight against them. Okay, so the scroller type, the effects can happen once, as we saw a minute, or we can have effects repeated, which means if we saw that scroll up and down, that would happen every single time we saw the slider going backwards and going forwards. So going forwards, you saw it slide from the bottom upwards. Going backwards, it would slide from the top downwards. And then you've got snapping effects. So let's just have a quick look at snapping effects. And again, we'll stick with the up down because we know what it is now and see the differences between them. We've got an easing for our snapping. I suggest mostly stick with the power easings because they are the most effective, and easing out. Hopefully you know what easings are. I'm not going to go through a whole lesson on that. But if we go back to our slider and refresh our screen, you can see that just a little jiggle of the mouse and it snaps and says, okay, we're going right to the end and right to the beginning. Again, that's got effects on it, so you can see the effect taking place. And we've got effects, what did I call it? Repeat. So it goes on the way there and on the way back. So those are basically your scroll slide types. Again, just to go over it, you've got scrolling, which is the regular one. I would suggest use that most of the time. And then snapping and effects give us a nice snappy scroller, or a scroller with some interesting skews and transforms on it, just to add a bit of variety. Again, if people use them and think, oh, it would be nice if we had X, Y, and Z, then let me know. So the next bit, the scroll step, that is basically, if we go back to the front page, now it's difficult to get this across, but I'm going little steps for the snapping. I don't have to move the mouse very much because my scroll step is normal, but it's more obvious if we switch to scrolling and save it again and have a look at the front. So where you've got the scroll step is normal, and refreshing the screen, I'm doing a wheel, drag, 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 and you see they're fairly small steps. So if we go back here and we take our scroll step there and set it to extra tiny, which is extra small, save that, go back and refresh our page, then again you can see these are even tinier steps. So we'll go back to the beginning, and our scroll steps are extra large scroll steps, and save that, go back here and refresh the screen, and when we get here and scroll, we're moving in larger steps. Now they're not huge, I'm doing this on a fairly large screen, but I found it's better to have it moving slower. If people feel like it needs to be oiled up in one way or another, we can do adjustments, but I think these are good speeds and they work generally across all devices. So if it moves too fast, people just won't see the sections you're trying to get them to look at. So that's your scroll step. And then we have drag. Now drag is useful, but again has to come with a warning. Now if we've got the scrolling type and we can put our buffer on, then we've got a chance at using drag and it looking quite nice. So I'm going to put it on sleepy, so that's the extreme end of drag, and we'll save it. Let's have a quick look at what that means. So we get to here and I'm going to drag, and as I let go of the mouse you can see it sort of takes a moment. It's easing basically through the scroll. So I drag and stop, and for quite a long time afterwards it keeps moving left and right. So sort of adding a little buttery scroll to it. However, as you can imagine, when you reach the end here, we've got the buffer and things look lovely. But if you don't have a buffer, then when you're dragging slowly, I'll show you it in a minute, it can look a bit sudden at the end, which is why you need to kind of build these horizontal scrollers with the sort of limits in mind. So if we go here and we choose effects repeat, you notice the buffer disappears. You just can't have one, because if you add any sort of slow down at the beginning or the end, all of the effects go completely bonkers, and there is literally nothing I can do about that, so don't do it. But anyway, we've got a large scroll step and we've got a sleepy drag, so we're going to save that. And if you come back to the front page and have a look at it, as we're moving through you can see that it's kind of got that slow catch up, which is nice. But there you go, so you can see that big jump at the end. The animation didn't really get a chance to finish because I reached the end of the scroll before the animation had caught up, until you get that jump. So this is why I say use it mindfully, and generally speaking stick with the scroll unless you can find nice ways, like if you design the section underneath that you're working on to fit nicely with the section above it, you can actually ease that jump a little bit visually. But if you want to use these effects, the best is to not have any drag at all. So down here we've got the option of switching that off if I let go of my control key, and then there is no drag, which means when you get to the end it will always have caught up with itself, so you'll get slightly less of an obvious visual jump, because you can see there's no weighting and it's just a bit smoother. Okay, so different types of scroll, and then the scroll step is how much is the slider going to move with every wheel turn, or obviously on mobile there's touch, but with mobile you can have very little control over the touch without hijacking it, and that isn't seen well. So the scroll step is mainly going to affect you on desktop. Then you've got the effect type if you're going to have effects, but if you've just got scrolling, that will disappear because it doesn't count. So the scroll step, speed of scroll, and then the drag, the easing, how long it takes the scroll to catch up with the mouse, and that can add a nice effect to it, especially with scrolling because you've got the buffer at the beginning and the end. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much our sticking behaviors, how they work and what they mean. Hopefully that makes sense. The next thing we can look at is our fancy slides. So if we enable our fancy slides, we've got some effects that we can use. I am going to make this at some point so that the effect is targeted at a particular class, but at the moment the effect is targeted at the children, the direct children of your slide. So in this case, if we look at the scroll slide, the direct child is the heading, the next direct child is the text. If I want them to scroll, if I want them to have individual effects, I can leave them like that. If I wrap them both in a div, only the div will have the effect applied to it. So with our effect type, we've got drops and slides and zooms and tilts. I'm not going to go through all of them. If we just use the drop, it's a fairly clear and obvious thing. I'm going to just turn my mouse cursor off. So if we use the drop, then we can say what length of time our drop's going to take. So let's say a whole second for the sheer love of it all. And is it going to drop a long way or a short way? Well, let's stick it somewhere in the middle. Do we want it to fade in as well? Yes, we do. And then we've got easings, which again you can use generally power, but I'm going to show bounce. In fact, now I'll show elastic even, just so that you can see it taking place and in and out. Now, the position start is the same as our stick position. So when do we want the children to fade in or drop in this case? And this would be, let's say, 75 from the top. So this would be 3/4 of the way down the screen. We want to trigger these effects. You don't need to worry about it, but the first slide will obviously be moving vertically. So that actually will trigger 75% from the top. The horizontal slides are moving horizontally, so they will trigger 75% from the left. And then we will stagger, and we'll have a crikey stagger, huge stagger, just so you can really see, obviously, what the effect is and what it's doing. So if I save that, and we go back again to our live site, when I scroll in, boing, so it's fairly quick, but you can see the elastic dong, as we drop in and animate. There we go. So again, we can have a larger amount, we can have it lasting for 3 seconds, we can stagger it less. Let's go back down to medium, and you can see the bounce. Sorry, the elastic, bounce, just so we can see something really obvious happening. Save it, refresh our screen, boing, and you can see it's horrible using the bounce because it's much too much, but it does make it obvious what's happening. So you can see our elements dropping in. Yeah, and as I say, you can have them slide in from the left, zoom in, tilt, stretch, rotate, and you can vary the amount of time the effect takes, and eventually, if you get used to it, let's stick it on medium and use a slightly nicer easing that maybe just eases out, generally is quite nice and not too long. We save that. There, you get a much gentler effect. See? As I said, that will affect every first child. So you can see it's affecting the heading, and then the text is sliding in afterwards. That's what the stagger is. Each element will take a little bit of time to catch up with the first element, so you get this kind of staggered effect. If I don't want to stagger the heading and the text, I can wrap them in a div and they will both appear at the same time. But eventually I want to be able to do this so you can target a class and then only animate the things in here that you want to animate. But otherwise, that is a pretty solid introduction to what our slider does effects wise and slide wise. So there are a few other bits. The show markers will show you the markers of when things will kick in. It's a GSAP thing. It's useful for solving problems. If I switch markers on and go to the front, you can see this is saying this is when your scroll slider will stick, because that's the start of the scroll slider animation. Here is where our fancy text drops in. Here's where our fancy text will come in for scrolling horizontally. See, so fancy text 1 will kick in there, and so on and so forth. It's likely you probably never will use those, but if you start switching animations on and nothing's happening, you can sometimes switch that on and it will either not show a marker, so you know you haven't enabled it, or it will show a marker in the wrong place and you'll realise you haven't set up the start position properly or something similar. It can be helpful. And the second thing is the important thing. So this is how to use the slider scroller so it works, basically. A couple of things. The easing guide is quite handy. It will show you the power in and the elastic and the sine and all the easings and how they work, which is quite useful. And the transform guide will show you how transforms work. So it's useful to know that a transform on the opacity 0 is invisible and 1 is fully visible. Whereas obviously a rotate is going to be between 0 degrees and any number of degrees. You could rotate it 6 times, but so it's not always going to be between the same numbers. This will help you work out how to make the transforms work for you. And the transform playground, you can actually go in and you can apply transforms and see what they're doing. But the most important thing is this orange bit here. So because this is Breakdance and it's trying to work in Breakdance, and really GSAP is kind of more for how I would say it, raw HTML and having full control over your DOM and your structure. We don't have that because it's Breakdance, and as glorious as Breakdance is, we don't have control over all of our divs and being able to wrap them. So to get this lovely pinning behavior here where it sticks to the top of the screen, you have to stick the rest of the web page. You can't stick the body because things go a bit awry. So you have to stick here the element above and here the element below. So what actually happens is when this runs on the front end, my slider automatically wraps the section below here and the section above in a div, and then that is the whole thing that sticks, so that it looks like the scroll slider is sticking and everything else is sitting nicely where it should. That basically means that if I were to take this scroll slider and duplicate it and put it in the section underneath, then it's going to just completely fall to pieces, I'm afraid, because it's trying to wrap a div. Our first scroll slider, look, it doesn't know where to stick, doesn't know what to do with itself, and the second one, well, goodness knows, it's just a total car crash. But that is expected and unavoidable. So what we have to do is take the section above it and duplicate that section so that there's at least 2 sections between any 2 scroll sliders. If I save that, this scroll slider can now wrap around the section above it, and actually because there's no section below it, it'll wrap around the footer, but that's fine. And this scroll section here can wrap around the section above it and the section below it so that it can hold them all together and pin them when it's staying still. And then when we come here and renew our page, we get our animations back, our sticky scrollies. I'm whizzing through them a bit quick, but there you go. And then we get our second slider, and there we go. So golden rule, that one really. If you put two sliders on the page and they fall apart, that'll be why. You have to have two sections. There's literally nothing that can be done about that because of the limits of control we get over the HTML structure. Okay, so that covers most of the basics. There's a couple of other bits. If we have a look at this first slider, I'm going to get rid of the second one just for easiness of what we're doing. It might be that you want to have the slider on desktop, but on mobile you just want a set of vertical sections. Maybe it just doesn't suit it to sit on mobile. Mobiles is a much narrower device. It doesn't always work. So you can, using our style settings, disable on mobile and say, right, I'm going to disable this on, and we'll pick tablet landscape, so it's fairly quick to collapse, and we can see obviously that it's going to collapse. Now, if we go to tablet landscape, there we go. We simply have a set of sections. Now they're kind of rough and ready because we haven't really styled these sections. When it's in a scroll slider, each section is assumed to be the same height. So if we go to our scroll slider here and our options over here, let's go back to desktop while we do that. Then we've got the container height, and I could say I actually want the container height to be 50 viewport height. And I now have a scroller that is 50 viewport height, and it will happily work that way. And I can set it to stick anywhere I like on the screen, and all of my scroll slides inside it are going to be limited to 50 viewport height, no problem. But once we then say, well, actually I want to see this on mobile, boom, and it collapses, we think, well, they all look a bit squished up now. Now it's not a fancy header. So you would have to go into the scroll slider, the slide itself as opposed to the slider. And then you've got your options for width and height, and I can say on tablet I want this to be, say, 80 viewport height, and that will now look a little bit prettier on mobile devices. So again, let's say this one I want to be exactly 700 pixels. I can set that, and then it will appear nice on mobile. I can set my spacing, I can add padding, I can do what I like, but it's just important to remember that yes, it will collapse wherever you want to set your breakpoint on a mobile device, and it will look perfectly nice, but you will need to style it specifically. And there's one extra thing to be aware of on that, which is if we stop collapsing, so we're looking at this back on our desktop, the scroll slider, oh, I've left that at percent, that doesn't matter, but there you go. The scroll slider itself will dictate the height. However, if I go into one of the slides, and this is remembering the height, look, we're on desktop, so the height is 100%. It is set at 100%, and I do ask nicely if we can leave it at 100%. But if I change my mind and say, no, I absolutely want this at 140 viewport height, you can see the slide is now 140 viewport height, but it just simply means that the overflow will be hidden and your slide will just look like crap. So don't do it. Leave that at 100%, and by all means choose your device size there and set it specifically for whatever device size you want it to be, but leave the desktop at 100% or your slides just aren't going to work. I wanted to make it easier than that, but there's no way of locking these settings in Breakdance. If I come up with a better solution that's a bit more bulletproof, I'll do it, but you know, there's a message and these lovely instructions. Hopefully it's clear enough. So I think there's lots more you can see and do, and all the jolly excitement of stuff. As I've said before, you can change the padding, you can add dividers to slides, you can set their borders, you can do just about anything you can do with a section. You've seen that you can set the background, and you've seen that you can change the layout settings. They all work, and you can put a grid in it, do what you like. But the fundamentals are about the size, leaving the height alone at 100% for the individual slides, and then setting slide height individually if you want to when you collapse on mobile. And then in the scroll slider itself, you can set the height. And if we remove that, it will assume that no height is set, therefore we want a full height element at 100 viewport height. You can also, if you prefer to work, being able to see all of it vertically, you can disable it on desktop. Obviously you'll then have to go in and add some padding and whatnots to the slides individually to decide. This one actually thinks it's 100 pixels, so that's going to be quite small. But yes, it means you can see each one individually, and you can work on it individually if you prefer to work that way. And then when you've finished, you can then set it back to collapse either not at all or on the actual breakpoint you want it to collapse on. But effectively that gives you two ways of working with it. I much prefer myself to have it this way because they're the right height and it's just easier, and my brain likes it that way. But it's free for you to use as you want. And that's it. Add scroll slides, add scroll sliders, add as many as you like, but please make sure that you've got 2 sections in between if you do have more than one slider, and it does say here, so if you forget, I will come around with my naughty stick. And then yeah, you can basically have slides that just scroll, slides with effects, and fading in titles and whatnots. Play with it at your leisure. I hope this makes a lot of sense to you. There is a Facebook page. Do feel free to drop questions there if you have any. And thank you very much.